Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience, and welcome to our webinar, Cloud-Based versus On-Site CTMS, which is right for your organization, presented by BioPharm Systems, Param Singh, who is the Vice President of Clinical Trial Management Solutions, and Sally Sweeney, who is Director of Validation for BioPharm. I'm Eugene Stefanov, BioPharm's Marketing Manager, and I'll be going over some housekeeping items before I turn it over to Param and Sally. So during the presentation, all participants will be in what's called listen-only mode. You can submit questions to the speakers at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please make sure you answer you state your questions as clearly as possible. Other webinar participants will not see your questions or comments. Questions will be addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you still have unanswered questions or you want to request additional information from BioPharm, feel free to visit the company's website for contact information. Our website, as you know, is www.biopharm.com. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on BioPharm's website within about 24 hours. I just want to let everyone know that we are having some technical difficulties. Hopefully the webinar is being actually recorded, but there is a chance that it is not. We will be emailing you a link with the recording as long as it happens. So this concludes our housekeeping items. I would now like to turn the call over to Param Singh and Sally Sweeney.
Thanks, Eugene. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar, Cloud-Based versus On-Site CTMS. Eugene, can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
So I just want to start out by introducing myself. My name is Param Singh, and I am the Vice President lead of the Clinical Trial Management Solution practice at BioPharm Systems. I've been working in the industry for the past 14 years, and almost exclusively in that time been working with Siebel Clinical and CTMS. Before joining BioPharm 5.5 years ago, I was part of Accenture's pharma R&D practice for a number of years and leading Siebel CTMS implementations there as well. And overall, now I've been part of over 30 projects related to Siebel Clinical implementation and integration. And these all vary from implementations of pharmaceutical companies, CROs, medical device companies, academic institutions, and they all range from local small implementations to global implementations of over 4,000 users. So that's a little bit about myself, and I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Sally Sweeney. Sally is the Director of Validation at BioPharm, and she's worked in the industry for over 20 years now. She's a validation expert, and as Director of the validation team, she is responsible for our computer system validation, methodology, system development lifecycle methodology, and her team performs all of the project-related validation activities for both internal and client projects. Sally is responsible for both, like I said, client and internal BioPharm Systems implementations to ensure that they're in accordance with external regulations and industry best practices. And Sally was also part of the Siebel Clinical implementation team in the past, so she's an expert in all aspects of Siebel CTMS implementations as well. And today Sally is going to be presenting on the topic of validation with regards to hosted and cloud systems. And since this is a hot topic, we wanted to make sure that we bring on an expert to present and answer your questions during the webinar. So now that I've introduced myself and Sally, I'd like to just take a minute to talk about my team here at BioPharm and explain a little bit more of what we do before we get into the key topic of today's webinar. We provide a variety of services and products related to clinical trial management. We manage implementations of Siebel Clinical, whether those are custom implementations or implementations of our Siebel Clinical Accelerator Ascend. And also, if you've seen some of our previous webinars, you know that we do extensive work with integrations in Siebel Clinical and related systems. And our approach to system implementation is very process-focused. So we also provide our process consulting services in order to help organizations define and harmonize their SOPs and business process across their organization with respect to clinical trial management. And we offer comprehensive training services and products related to Siebel Clinical as well. That's just a glimpse of some of the services and products that we offer within our practice. And BioPharm as an organization has a safety and pharmacovigilance practice, EDC and clinical data management, as well as data warehousing and life science data hub practice as well. So here's a look at today's agenda. We've already covered welcomes and introductions, so we'll first move into defining the term cloud. It's used in a variety of contexts, and first we wanted to define the term and its uses and its implication in our industry. Next we'll look at the industry trends with respect to cloud and hosting and where we see organizations in our industry moving in relation to this approach. And then we're going to have an interactive session where we'll cover a variety of claims about hosting and try to determine which are myths and which are facts. And we're trying a new feature today on the webinar where you as a participant will get to interact with today's webinar by providing answers to these claims. And as we all collectively try to become cloud and hosting mythbusters. And at that point, I'll hand off the presentation to Sally. And Sally's going to cover validation implications of cloud and hosted systems. And then we'll summarize some of what we've learned and look at what organizations need to consider in evaluating whether to implement a CTMS system on-site versus in the cloud or hosted. We'll briefly cover how BioPharm and our team can help in that evaluation and in implementation of the CTMS. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And as a reminder, if you do have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the chat feature on your screen, on the left-hand side of your screen, I believe. And then we'll address as many of those questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. So you don't have to wait to submit your questions until the end. As you have questions as we go through this, please feel free to put them in the chat feature. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So let's start with the definition of the cloud. This term is used quite frequently these days. And in each case, it's used in a slightly different way. So we wanted to try to define it a bit more clearly and how it relates to our industry. So this is the latest IT service system delivery model. It's also known as on-demand or SaaS or software as a service. It's essentially internet-based computing where you have a cluster of servers which provide access to software and data from any online computer at any time. So we as individuals have been using cloud-based services for quite a long time now. So you can think about internet email systems like Hotmail and Gmail. So as individual users, we've been using these for a long time, that we can go anywhere on the internet and access our Gmail account. And you know, it's our specific account that we can see the data in our inboxes. So this is based on the concept that the consumer no longer needs or wants the expertise or physical control over the technology infrastructure that supports them. So in a sense, you know, we don't necessarily need to house our own email servers, for example. Individually, there are plenty of services for individuals that can access these cloud-based services. But On the larger sense, we're going to be obviously talking about organizational cloud-based services and systems that are available. So in the life science industry, this is done through hosted clinical systems. And in most cases, when we refer, in our industry, when we refer to the cloud, it's actually the equivalent of hosting or a hosted system. Hosting is a more appropriate term for the offerings of clinical solutions offered via internet by vendors than cloud. But for our industry, and for the purposes of the webinar, cloud and hosting are used interchangeably. There are two versions of hosting. Typically, dedicated hosting is where your organization owns the software and the hardware, but the services related to the housing and maintenance of the application is given to a vendor. Shared hosting is similar. I'm sorry. Having some technical difficulties on my end. Apologize for that. So going back a slide here, cloud is related to hosting, but it's a bit more specific. It's a bit more specific aspect of hosting. So cloud functions like a utility, such as electricity. So the power grid stores electricity. When the demand increases, more sections of the grid are engaged. And when demand decreases, fewer sections of the grid are engaged. So you only pay for what you use. We don't care where the electricity really comes from and how many hops it took to get to us, as long as we have access to it. True cloud offerings operate in the same way. So where your software and the data is the utility that you're purchasing, the number of users or data storage is the size. Data storage size is the demand of each customer, and then the power grid is the cluster of servers. So in a true cloud, we really don't care where the software or data is coming from, as long as we have access to it. Again, with the Gmail example, I personally, as a user, don't really care where and how my mailbox and messages are stored, as long as I have access to my inbox over the internet from any internet location that I choose to access it from. So for clinical applications, so now, obviously from an individual user perspective, that makes sense. But for clinical applications, a true cloud is not really feasible due to compliance, data integrity, data security, and intellectual property reasons. So again, just continuing with the example of Gmail, this is not an issue as a user. But with clinical systems, there needs to be full transparency as to where the data is stored, how the data is stored, and how it's secured. So in a typical cloud setting, the data is mirrored and could be coming from a variety of servers based on when and where you try to access it. Whereas for clinical systems, there needs to be full transparency as to where this data is stored, and that it's accurate, it's safe, and it's secure. So like I mentioned before, there are two different versions of hosting, dedicated and shared hosting. And this is the typical sort of offering that we see when it comes to clinical systems. And again, dedicated hosting is where you own all the software and the hardware, but you're simply just relying on the services, the IT infrastructure services related to housing and maintaining the application. Whereas shared hosting, you rely on the vendor to provide the hardware as well, and it's housed and maintained by the vendor through virtualization and can be shared with other organizations. So industry trends, our industry is typically late in adopting new IT trends. Since organizations are looking to regulatory authorities to evaluate and provide guidance on how to utilize these emerging technologies and approaches in a regulated industry and environment. So our industry, rightly so, is very cautious about how to use these emerging technologies, while other industries for some time now, specific to cloud and hosting, have embraced it. Clinical organizations were slow to make the move into that direction. But we've seen continued pressure to reduce cost and shorten drug development times due to expiring patents and shrinking drug pipelines over the last several years. So organizations recognize that their focus as an organization needs to be on effective, efficient drug development. New technologies and systems have been developed to address the need to move away from paper towards electronic data capture and management, and other infrastructure is secondary. So where homegrown systems were the norm, organizations are now relying on vendors to provide those services, so they can focus on their core business. So again, where homegrown systems were the norm in our industry, now organizations are relying on vendors to provide and maintain the IT infrastructure to support their needs. Organizations are realizing that cloud and hosting allows them to move away from capital expenditures and instead just pay for what they need and when they need it. And there's significant cost savings in terms of human capital, physical capital, storage space, and utility costs. Business advantages include standardizing and streamlining of operations. However, many organizations are still concerned about security, privacy, and data protection when it comes to management in the cloud. So now we're going to move into our interactive part of today's webinar. So you're all going to get a chance to become, like I said, mythbusters. So I'm going to make a claim in each poll, and each of you will vote whether you think that's a fact or a myth. And we'll look at the results of the poll, and then I'll present some of our thoughts on the claim as we go through this. So hopefully this will, our technical issues aside, hopefully this works the way we want it to work. So let's move on to the first claim. So the first one is a CTMS implementation can be implemented faster in the cloud than on-site. So we'll take a few seconds so everyone can vote. So if you're voting, you should be seeing the results on the screen. Give it another second or two. So it looks like overwhelmingly people are voting that this is a fact, or the majority are, but there's still a large number of you that think that that's a myth. So let's look at the next slide. So it is a fact. So while the reason that we can do this a lot faster in the cloud is typically vendors will have pre-qualified data centers, so the due diligence may be reduced but to reviewing hosting vendors' most recent audit reports at the data center. So you don't have to necessarily go through those types of activities. There's already a process in place. Then when we're talking about the actual servers themselves, we're not waiting for procurement to purchase servers and do hardware qualifications and things like that. So there's pre-qualified servers that can be used immediately, so that significantly reduces the time. And then just from a CTMS perspective, there are pre-qualified CTMS templates, so there could be, in some cases, already validated environments that can be used to clone new environments. So that'll save a lot of time from the implementation as well. So that one was a fact. We'll move on to our next claim. A CTMS can be implemented less expensively in the cloud than on site. So we'll take a couple minutes here. A couple seconds, actually. So it looks like we have about an 80-20 split. The vast majority of you are saying that this is a fact. Go to the next slide here. Eugene, can you push us to the next slide, please? Okay, so that's a fact as well. Or while these may not be true for every situation, most typically that you can do a lot of cost reductions in a cloud environment. Again, all of the things that we mentioned from pre-qualification of vendors and hardware and template environments rings true, but you reduce the need for internal resources to manage your IT infrastructure. You could potentially look at a CTMS accelerator option, a shared hosting option, on-demand option, and all of those things will ultimately reduce costs. So next claim is ongoing costs for cloud and hosted CTMS solutions are higher than for on-site solutions. So if we're paying monthly for a hosted solution, that's going to cost more in the long run. So if you take a few seconds to answer that. So it looks like people are leaning towards that this is a myth. The next slide. And that's true. So that's a myth. So while hosted solutions do have, again, regular monthly costs associated to the service and the systems that are provided, these fees are typically designed to include all of the services and maintenance that you would normally spend time, effort, resources, and money on, such as end-user support. So you're relying on the vendor's support organization for the most part. Any sort of bug fixes or issues that arise in the application, that's typically on the vendor. Issue resolution for those issues that are found. System performance monitoring. If the system goes down, the vendor is responsible for that. Any sort of hardware maintenance, if you have to apply patches and things like that, those are typically designed within those fees. And then, ultimately, after a few years, hardware needs to be upgraded. The servers need to be upgraded. So the full cost of full server upgrades and replacement is typically on the vendor, of course. So when calculating all of these costs and of these services and resources needed, the monthly hosting fees can be lower than the equivalent in-house costs for all of those activities. So the next claim is CTMS data stored in the cloud can be accessed anytime. Let's take a couple seconds here. So if you're looking at the results, it looks like the majority have picked that that's a fact. We can access our data anytime. And that's true in most cases. So hosted applications and data are by design available through a web browser from any computer connected to the internet. Typically, you don't need to install any software on the machine that you're accessing the system from, other than potentially some ActiveX components or additional components on your browser. And when we're looking at, system uptime do vary from vendor to vendor, but this is one of the key performance indicators when you're looking at a vendor is the uptime, and typically a lot of them are claim over 99% uptime. So these are they schedule any sort of maintenance outside of business hours, and unplanned downtime is pretty minimal. And then there's typically backups and failovers and things like that in place from a good vendor. CTMS data in the cloud and hosted systems is not secure. That's our next claim. So take a few seconds to answer that. Okay. Okay, so it looks like just everybody, well, it's about 80-20 split, leaning towards myth. And that's right. So while it's difficult to secure data for industry standards in a true cloud environment, hosted data can be easily secured. So when we're, again, that's the specific nuance and difference of a true cloud versus a hosted system. Hosted systems can live behind firewalls, require VPN access. They can be securely deployed over the internet using SSL encryption. Hosted systems can be integrated with an organization's Active Directory or LDAP authentication process, and can be set up to meet each organization's data security policy and procedures. So again, since we have the transparency in a hosted system as to where the data is, we can secure that data for that organization and be transparent about where it is and how it's accessed. Next claim is data from other systems cannot be migrated to a CTMS solution in the cloud. Okay. So it looks like, again, we have a majority leaning towards that's a myth. And that's true, it's a myth. So data can be migrated from other systems into a hosted CTMS just like an in-house CTMS, so just like an on-site implementation. So hosting does not limit data migration methods or sources of data for that migration. So, and CTMS data migration sources can include spreadsheets, access databases, homegrown applications, previously used CTMS solutions, whether they're hosted or in-house, and other hosted or in-house systems as well. So from a data migration perspective, whether it's hosted or not, doesn't limit you in that perspective at all. The next claim we have is that CTMS solutions, one-time data migration is one thing, but CTMS solutions in the cloud cannot be integrated with other systems that are not hosted. We'll give a few more seconds for everyone to vote. Looks like, again, everyone's leaning towards that is a myth. Eugene, do you mind going to the next slide? Having some issues on this side. And yes, that is a myth. So while integration is different than data migration typically is a one-time load. Ongoing integrations that happen on either real-time or batch mode, on a particular frequency. The thought is that hosted systems can't integrate like that, and that's not true. So hosting doesn't limit integration methods or types of systems that you can integrate to as well. So all the typical CTMS implementation or integrations that we can do, whether it's an on-site or another vendor provided EDC or IVR solution, an in-house financial system for payment requests and processing details, safety system for serious advance tracking, or a document management system, clinical data warehouse, or CRO CTMS solutions. So if you have CRO partners that have their own systems and you're hosting a CTMS with a vendor, all of those integrations are possible and possible in the same way, right? That it would be an on-site implementation of the CTMS. The next claim we have is choosing a hosted CTMS means relying on the vendor for all your system administration tasks. So obviously if you're on site, you have those capabilities, but if you're hosting it, then that falls on the vendor. So take a few seconds to vote whether that's a myth or a fact. These are the closest results that we had so far. So it looks like it's an even split, where half of you are thinking that's a myth and half of you are thinking that's a fact. Let's look at the details behind that, and we'll spend a little bit of time here. So that's a myth. So while the solution or the application and the servers might be maintained and housed by the vendor, and this will vary from vendor to vendor and product to product, but most sort of solutions that we've looked at find that solutions will still allow organizations to perform administration functions in the application. So like creating new users, creating not only new users, but new user types. So if you have new user roles within the application, or you want to modify user access to certain areas of the application, that's typically something that you want to retain that administration capability within your organization, rather than relying on submitting tickets to change user access anytime you need to do that. User account maintenance, updating, deleting, adding users, deactivating users, things like that. So, as your team changes, you don't want to rely on, again, sending tickets to have users deactivated. So, typically, you would want that sort of control of administration within your organization. Report template modifications. So, anytime you need to do new reports within the application, you don't necessarily want to rely on a vendor to provide that. And any sort of other administration, like drop-down lists within for those of you that are familiar with Siebel, the list of values administration and template administration, all of those things are still things that you want to retain that capability. And the next bullet basically says, a good CTMS hosting vendor provides all the services that require IT expertise. So anything that is typically an IT function, you still want to rely on them, on a vendor for like performance monitoring of the servers and patching and things like that. But the we want to empower the organization. You don't want to necessarily lose some control of basic system use activities and rely on the vendor for those particular functions. So, if you're looking to evaluate a hosted system in any, whether it's a CTMS or other systems, you want to make sure that you do have some flexibility as to administration functions that you can perform on your own hosted system. Claim number 9 is systems in the cloud or hosted can be configured or customized. We'll take a few seconds. And if we're looking at the results, it looks like, again, the majority is fixed stock. And if we move to the next slide, that is a fact. So when we think about sort of the true cloud services, there's not much customization or configurability that we see. The value add of a true cloud service is that you can get up and running very, very quickly, but there's not a whole lot you can do to make it very specific to your needs. But for a hosted system like this, a clinical system, whether it's hosted or on-site, a configurable CTMS, and again, not all CTMS are configurable, but can be configured and or customized to meet the organization's needs. So hosting doesn't really play a factor in that. It doesn't limit the ability to configure or customize it. It will take more time to implement. So again, when you're looking at evaluating the value add of having a hosted system and getting it live very, very quickly, if you want additional configuration, obviously that'll increase the time a little bit. But there are certain solutions that will help you still reduce the need for custom configurations and reduce the time that it takes to implement. So CTMS accelerators that are offered in a hosted or on-demand fashion should still reduce the need of custom configurations and decrease the timeline and cost. And the last claim that we have is that hosted CTMS solutions cannot be validated. And it looks like the vast majority of you have picked out that that's a myth, which is a key topic of today's webinar. So again, while true cloud is very, very challenging to validate when we have this scenario of the power grid again and sort of not really knowing the transparency of where our data is and how secure it is and how many hops it takes to get us to access our data. Opting for a hosted clinical system doesn't hinder the ability to validate or maintain a validated state for your system. But there are some additional considerations, obviously, for hosted systems and additional steps that organizations need to take to ensure that integrity, security, safety, accessibility, and compliance of those hosted applications and data. So with that, I want to turn it over to our expert, and I'll turn it over to Sally, who's going to go over a little bit in detail around validation in the cloud. Sally?
Thank you, Param. Hello, everyone. As Param has mentioned, more and more companies are entertaining the idea of cloud technology or hosting for their regulated applications with the intention of significant cost savings. When considering whether to subscribe to hosting services, or use a cloud computing model for a GXP system, the challenges in terms of regulatory compliance and validation should be thoroughly vetted before deciding on which strategy works best for your organization. It's important to note that with an off-site hosted or cloud solution, you will not have physical access to the hardware. This introduces challenges if your internal processes and validation models dictate that hardware qualification is required. In cases where the solution is in the cloud, this also infers a virtualized hardware environment, potentially further complicating your hardware qualification. You should be aware of these differences and adjust decisions surrounding the model you choose accordingly. Using a cloud assumes that you do not own the hardware nor the software, as Param already mentioned. You're basically leasing the service to be able to use the application on demand. As your demands increase, your subscription increases accordingly. However, using a cloud presents a greater risk than hosting because instead of your data living on a single physical server that can be qualified in a data center that can be audited, your data is instead shared across an entire network of servers, which could be located anywhere around the world. Hardware qualification is unlikely with no single server location and with servers being virtual. There may be too many data centers to feasibly audit. Additionally, with the cloud, you may not have control over when patches are applied to the system, and the timing of that could be totally up to the cloud service provider. With shared hosting, this is where you own the software application, but you're essentially leasing the hardware on which your software resides. A hosting provider maintains it, and it is housed in a data center. With shared hosting, there's a little more risk, just a little, than the dedicated hosting model because your servers are shared with others. A strong service level agreement, or SLA, with the hosting provider is key, and an on-site audit of the data center should be performed to ensure your data is secure and protected. Of these three, dedicated hosting is the model with the least amount of risk. Here you own the hardware and the software application, but you're using a data center to house the hosting provider, you're using a data center to house and a hosting provider to maintain the servers. So no one is sharing the servers with you as with the shared hosting model. At any time, you still have the ability to bring the hardware and software in-house. As with the shared hosting, an SLA with the hosting provider and an on-site audit of the data center should be performed. Regardless of which model is used, if the system is a GXP system, regulatory compliance must be adhered to, just as it would be if it were established on-site. If you can demonstrate that a system meets all predicate regulatory rule requirements and performs its intended functions, then it is compliant. But who is ultimately responsible for compliance and security when your application is being hosted on the cloud? It's actually your organization who's responsible for ensuring that your GXP system is validated, compliant, and performs as intended, even when using a vendor who provides validation materials and performs validation activities for you. Therefore, when considering a hosted or cloud application, serious considerations and due diligence in vendor selection should be undertaken. Any vendors offering cloud or hosting solutions who refuse to undergo scrutiny should not be considered for GXP hosting systems. Having a trustworthy and highly responsive service provider helps keep your data safe and your systems running. This slide and the next list important questions to consider when selecting a vendor. Does the vendor have experience in hosting the application of interest? How much experience do they have? Are they able to provide references from their current clients? Does the vendor use a third-party data center? If so, what sort of oversight does the vendor have on the third party? Does the vendor have a qualified instance of the hosted application that can be leveraged for potential cost savings? Does the vendor have validation experience for the application? Do they offer validation documentation that can be leveraged? Check to see if the vendor has strong validation procedures in place that have already been successfully used for other clients and that meet your requirements. These can be leveraged as is or customized and executed for your implementation to streamline deployment and to further increase efficiency. For small to mid-sized companies without a validation group or with a limited IT staff, outsourcing the validation of the system, whether in the cloud, hosted, or even on-site, is a significant benefit. You can leverage the expertise of the hosting provider to ensure your system is validated and retains its validation during the operation and maintenance phases without having to bring on additional employees. And a few more questions here. Does the vendor have a pool of well-trained system and functional experts, or actually are they resource constrained? Can they handle the anticipated number of users on the hosted system at any given time? And do they offer 24/7 support? What happens if the vendor stops doing business or is acquired? You need to ensure that your data would still be available to you if that were to happen. Depending on the size of your organization, you may have to rely on the hosting provider to control access to the system. For example, adding or modifying user accounts and privileges. This may be a benefit over having an on-site deployment depending on how knowledgeable and responsive the help desk is. Another benefit of using a hosting provider is that they would be under contract, your SLA, to respond within a given period of time. Maintaining control over your organization's data, especially R&D, proprietary, safety, or patient data, is paramount in your decision to implement a cloud-based or hosted platform. This slide lists important questions to ask the vendor regarding data security and access. What measures does the vendor have in place for physical and electronic security? Will the data storage and processing, where will the data storage and processing take place? Will it be in a single specific location? For small and mid-sized companies, the data center provided by the hosting company can be far superior to in-house data centers in terms of network, power, climate control, and security. Using a data center can greatly reduce risk of system outages and security breaches. Does the data center have current and available SSAE16 or SAS70 reports? Does the vendor have strong backup and recovery plans? And a few more questions. How are tenant applications isolated from each other? You need to make sure that the vendor will make a contractual commitment to obey privacy requirements on behalf of all of their clients. Will the vendor provide information on the training of their administrators and the controls over their access? Who will own and have access to your data? Once you select a vendor, make sure you have a CDA in place so your data does not end up in someone else's hands. Will the system be considered closed or open? Will it need to be accessed over VPN or SSL? If the method of accessing your GPX system is considered open, additional 21 CFR Part 11 regulations apply. An open system is one in which the system access is not controlled by persons who are responsible for the content of electronic records that are on the system. An open system could be considered one where the data is stored on a server that is under the control of a third party. For open GXP systems, in addition to the regulations for closed systems, controls such as document encryption and the use of digital signature standards should be employed and verified per Section 11.30 when validating your open GXP system. For instance, when accessing an open GXP system on the web, if employing TLS, which is Transport Layer Security, or SSL, which is Secure Socket Layer protocols, additional compliance testing for the open system could include capturing evidence of the TLS or SSL certificate. After you've considered several vendors for your hosted GXP system, perform an audit of the vendors and the data centers to verify that they can meet your needs. Obtain the current SSAE16 and SAS reports. Finally and importantly, Write up a strong SLA with your selected vendor that thoroughly protects you and your data. That's the end of my part of the presentation. Now Param will take over again to wrap it up. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sally. Let me go to the next slide here.
I did that already.
Okay. All right. So thanks, Sally, for an in-depth look at validation implementations for cloud and hosted systems. Hopefully everyone found that was very helpful information. So now let's just consider everything that we've discussed today in light of the questions posed in the webinar. Is a cloud CTMS or an on-site CTMS right for your organization? And this slide really lists out the key criteria to consider when asking yourself that question. And I want to go through the next couple of slides really quickly so we have time for questions and answers. So, on this slide, it's basically saying, these are the questions to ask internally, whether you're ready to adopt or, which sort of approach that you want to go to. So obviously from an IT perspective, what's the current state of my IT infrastructure? What's my IT organization's IT strategy for the future? Are we leaning more towards streamlining that infrastructure and looking at vendors? Or do we have a culture of sort of owning all of our applications internally? Space. Do we have the physical space available for additional servers for this application and others? And are we looking to grow or are we looking to scale back in that way? Budget. Does my budget allow for hardware purchases and upkeep, or is it more reasonable to look at a monthly fee for those things rather than upfront hardware purchases? So that might make the case for a cloud moving more towards a hosting model. Culture. What's my clinical operations team's tolerance for risk for having the data not within the company's firewall and on a vendor's servers. Validation. Do we have the experienced and knowledgeable validation resources that are available for vendor analysis and audits of either the data center, the implementation, and hosting vendor? And the last point is are there hosting vendors who provide a system that meets all our user requirements and whose business practices mitigate perceived and actual risk? So not only are we mature enough as an organization to take this on, but can we find a vendor who can meet our needs in that area and who's mature enough in their own sort of hosting offerings that can offer that service? And so the last slide that I have, and I'll just cover this really quickly, is how can BioPharm help with your needs in this area? So we can hold deep dive workshops or full analysis projects to analyze your company's process infrastructure and help you determine which approach will be the best fit for your company's needs. We can do detailed demonstrations of our accelerator solution, which we offer both in a shared and dedicated hosted implementation. And then once we determine the right path for you, we can provide development, implementation services, functional and technical application support services, and also with regards to training, we have several products and service offerings with regards to CTMS training and development and delivery. With regards to products that BioPharm has to offer in the area, again, providing demonstrations as well as sandbox environments to evaluate our CTMS accelerator and whether that's right for your organization. With regards to validation, we have, if you would like to take on validation tasks internally, you can purchase our complete validation suites for CTMS, for Siebel CTMS implementations. And we also have system agnostic as well as Siebel CTMS specific trial management SOPs that can help your organization standardize and harmonize the process across the organization as well. So with that, we have a few minutes left for questions and answers, and I'll turn it over to Eugene to sort of help facilitate those questions. Eugene?
Great. Thank you so much. So many of the questions that were asked were actually already answered during the presentation, but there are a few that are worth asking again, or they haven't been answered yet. So let's just move on to the first question. What if the server crashes? What backup methods are used to ensure data is not lost?
Okay. So typically, hosting vendors will have processes in place for failover and disaster recovery. So, for just if a server goes down, there's typically a mirrored failover. So the client or the end users should not see too much of a disruption. Typically, you're going to have access to your application. It'll sort of automatically route the users to the appropriate server that's up if one of them goes down. In a more drastic scenario, if there's a full-on disaster at an entire data center facility, typically you'll have your main servers located in one location at the data center, and a full set of mirrored servers at a completely different physical location, so that, again, you have that same scenario of disaster recovery in a larger sense.
Great, thank you. The next question is, our company uses a hosted system in a different country, and we access the data through an image in Citrix server without downloading any data to our local machine. Is that considered as cloud, or should we access the data in a web browser to be considered as a cloud system?
I would say that, well, again, both of those scenarios, you're accessing it through either a Citrix image or an internet browser. I would say that both of those have some aspect of cloud or hosting in it. With the Citrix example, obviously you have to have Citrix on your machine, and it's not just a web browser. But I would equate those to be the same. You're using different tools, but the system is still, I would say, hosted. Again, none of these are true cloud in any sense anyway, but you're accessing a system that's not physically local to your environment.
Okay, and we'll ask one more question, and we'll leave it at that. I know there are numerous other questions, but we just don't have the time to go through them on this call. But are there compliance-related issues in a shared hosting or multi-tenant environment? And I believe that's been addressed, but I think it's worth addressing that again.
Are there compliance-related issues in a shared hosting or multi-tenant environment? Sally, feel free to, to jump in or if you want to start, that's fine.
I mean, and it's basically just the stuff that I'd already covered about making sure that when you're selecting your vendor, do your due diligence and make sure that you are protected. Your data is secure by making sure that the data center is under the appropriate regulations, and they've had the AE16 and SAS 70 reports completed. Make sure you ask your vendor all of the pertinent questions to ensure that none of your data is being exposed to any of their other tenants.
Great, thank you. And just to close it off, last one more question. And question is, when migrating your data from other systems to a CTMS in the cloud, such as our homegrown system, which is not CFR Part 11 compliant, do you recommend migrating the data from those systems that are not compliant to a compliant CTMS in the cloud?
Well, I mean, when you're migrating data to a compliant system, you'll want to validate that data migration, right? So you'll want to, whether your source system is is validated or not, the data migration that you're bringing in, the data that you're bringing in will have to go through a series of test cases and ensure that it's in the right format. So I would say that, and this question comes up when we're also talking about integration between validated and non-validated systems as well. As long as your data and that you're integrating, or your integration and your data migration, that you're building, the routines and error handling and test cases that are surrounding the data migration and the integration are validated as part of that implementation, that's typically the approach that we take. With that, if the data is coming, whether or not the data is coming from a validated source system or a non-validated source system, it's essentially the mechanism of loading the data and ensuring that the data is in the right format and it's being transformed over and brought over in a consistent manner.
Great, thank you. So we've definitely used up all of our time for this webinar. We're about 2 minutes after the hour. But if you have additional questions, please feel free to contact us via phone or email. You can reach us, or our contact information is on the slide in front of you, or you can just visit biopharm.com for additional contact information. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent to everyone within 24 hours for you to share with your colleagues. Thank you so much for your participation, and we all hope that the information we provided you today was helpful. Just as a side note, we have an upcoming webinar August 29th, I believe, and that's doing global studies with Siebel CTMS, so please go ahead and register for that. You can see the link on our website. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great rest of the day and evening.